Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to Survivor Space and today's Survivor Circle session. I'm Becky Perkins, the Survivor Support Specialist here with Zero Abuse Project, and we're very happy that you've joined us today. I'm very pleased to welcome back Rick Goodwin from Men in Healing, who's going to talk a little bit about PTSD expression today. Before we get started, wanted to let everybody know that as usual, today's session is being live streamed on YouTube. You can watch the full screen of the live stream on YouTube. It will also be recorded. So if you're not able to attend the full session, you're able to go back and watch it later on. Also, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments for Rick today using the chat box on the Survivor Circles page. You just need to type in your question or comment where it says enter your message here. And we're gonna, Rick is gonna speak for a little while and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions and comments later on. So again, welcome, we're glad you're here. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rick.
Okay, thanks, Becky, and welcome everyone for today's big show. To get to what we're going to be talking about, we call it the wobble. I mean, there's many ways to describe post-traumatic expression. The wobble is the way we call about it in the shop that I work for. And we're going to be applying this commentary particularly towards men. Mind you that the trauma response, as we know it, is fairly universal. Wherever you are on this planet, whatever culture you are a member of, race, gender, what have you, we know that there's essentials, there's basics in the trauma response. But yet as a matter of reference, and that I'll be coming at it from using examples and presentation notions that may be well more situated in men's lives, knowing that our gender socialization does impact two things when it comes to trauma. One is our gender. If we're talking about, say, sexual abuse, sexual violence, gender plays a role in the immediate experience of the abuse or the assault. We have the gender of the victim survivor, and we also have the gender or genders of the offending parties. But we also know that our gender plays a hugely significant role in the expression of post-trauma. And so that's what we're going to focus in for today. And I just want to make reference that these webinar series is brought to you by the good people of the Department of Justice, who have given the Zero Abuse Project funding for this work. So there you go. Your tax dollars at work, and we are certainly pleased to be a benefit of this funding so that we can do this type of engagement with people like you. Okay, so let's get into it. Post-trauma expression. I think a lot of times when one is delving into the trauma field, now that could be from the lived experience of you going through your own experience of abuse or assault. It could be reading up because you have loved ones who have gone through this type of experience. You might be in a position of being a service provider yourself, whether that be as a healthcare professional, whether that be someone who does peer support work, and all the other allied helping professionals out there. We all have a tendency to want to learn more, and by doing that, there's a bit of a unfortunate tendency in our field that we really like to do lists. We like to make up lists. We like to have people read lists. And to me, there is a bit of a concern here. If one has a lived experience of trauma from these harms, then what goes on for that person as they read possibly hundreds of potential trauma symptoms? It becomes a bit numbing after a while. And this is a bit concerning because what we essentially want to do, we want to do a number of things. We want to give out the message of that this is understandable despite the overwhelmingness of trauma. We want to give out the message that there is hope in terms of overcoming trauma, even though that person could well be feeling helpless, if not hopeless, from the experience. But the last thing we want to do is make it overwhelming, because trauma in its nature is overwhelming. We don't want to repeat that process by showing lists of dozens, if not hundreds, of potential symptoms. That would almost be like re-injuring somebody. So this notion of the wobble, post-traumatic expression, we're gonna focus on 4 core topics, 4 aspects of post-traumatic stress that you need to learn of, and hopefully you can keep them at mind. Now, the other thing we're going to try to do today is, rather than present a static model of post-traumatic expression, like what a list does. It's like, okay, you're nodding your head, okay, that one, oh, and that one, and that one. It probably is a better way to learn about trauma, is to learn the dynamic of traumatic expression rather than a static top-down listing of what trauma is. So as best as I can do it, I'll try to incorporate that angle at understanding the work ahead. So just to say, as part of my introduction, I'm a social worker by training. I've been working in the fields of family violence, abuse recovery for probably scratching 3 decades now. And I run a small mental health clinic that specializes in the needs of men. So my experience and my knowledge set is pretty focused on that population. And again, in terms of the Q&A that we'll do before we finish today, happy to answer any questions you have on post-traumatic expression, and happy to answer any questions you may have concerning men or a male perspective on this. So let's slowly get into what this notion of the wobble. Now, what I can say is that much of our understanding comes from a particularly, I'll say, quite important book that came out in the early 90s by Judith Herman. Judith Herman is affiliated with Harvard University and was one of the leading minds back in all her years of study and research and writing concerning sexual violence against women. But her particular book in the early 90s, called Trauma and Recovery, was quite historic in many respects, because it was the first time in one book, the first time there was a book that spoke to not just one kind of trauma, but multiple lenses of trauma. So she incorporated certainly her experience of working with women experiencing sexual violence. And then she also tapped into the body of knowledge that we gained from American veterans from the Vietnam War. As you know, many of these, mostly men, came back, many of whom wrestled with trauma expression from their wartime experience. She also folded in the knowledge base we have of survivors of the Holocaust. So again, a different data set, a different population. And fourthly, she looked at the available research of people who survived torture in Argentina during the military junta years of the, I'm going to say late 70s, early 80s. So for a number of years, they had a military government. There was no court of law. Many people were murdered by the state, and even more people were tortured. So there we go. There was 4 knowledge sets in this book. And while Judith Herman didn't come up with post-traumatic stress, that formation of that disorder was done long before then. It still was an important book at showing us overall how we can understand trauma expression, particularly within the context of those particular behaviors, of those particular acts of violence. So in some ways, we're riffing here on what she called the dialectic of trauma. A dialectic being 2 opposing pieces of knowledge or knowledge sets, and there's tension between those 2. Now, over the years, we realized, well, we don't want to spend 10 minutes of every group therapy program that we work with men defining the term dialectic. So the analogy we use is those Russian wooden dolls, the dolls that nest into each other, and they have a round base, so they're always tippy. They wobble, and this we believe is a fair expression for post-traumatic stress. So, with Judith Herman's permission, I hope, let's get into the 4 core elements of post-traumatic stress. So the first thing that we should consider is the physiological basis of trauma. And here I'm touching my shoulders here. We know that trauma is anchored into our bodies. And really, this is the first expression of trauma after an act of danger and violence. It will go into our bodies, and then it will maintain itself in our bodies for an indefinite period of time. We can call this hyperarousal. So hyper meaning up, arousal meaning all our senses, not just touch. And so we need to consider then how trauma is situated in our bodies. If we understand that aspects of trauma are situated in bodies, then we can attend to our bodies in ways that are going to be helpful. So we could use different examples for kind of getting into what this could look like. I can use an example of, well, let's say it's one of us, and we're after our long day of whatever we're doing, we're walking home. So the day is done. We're kind of hungry. We're kind of tired. And let's say as we're walking home, the street is dark. And there we are. We're walking down the street, and we hear a noise behind us. And we don't know what it is. And as we're turning around, even before we can see what's going on behind us, we get a clunk on the head, we fall down, and someone has taken our purse or our wallet. And we can say that, okay, we've got a situation now of someone who has been a victim of mugging. Let's use that for an example, knowing that these components will manifest itself in different examples. Okay, well, let's say you're that person, that unfortunate person, and eventually you stand up, you shake the dust off your clothes, and if home is a safe place for you, you probably will want to get home before you do anything else. That being said, you're going to be wired even before you take your first step. That experience of danger and assault has changed every system in your body. This is what we know what danger does. It changes your respiratory rate, changes your heart rate, changes your digestive tract. It changes your almost every system within your body. There will be a noticeable change. So as you now are continuing your journey to get to your home, this needs to be considered. Now, here's something that's going to be going on. You're going to be constantly shoulder checking because you're going to be scanning your environment for further examples of danger. Now, it isn't like you're going to be consciously choosing to shoulder check every 30 seconds or what have you. You're going to be just kind of jerking your neck around. It's not going to be a conscious decision. So here's a core trait of what we need to know about hyperarousal. This is not a cognitive process. Our bodies do this naturally. Okay? So our body's going to go into auto mode, for lack of better words. And we're going to be doing things like shoulder checking. We're going to be doing things like we're going to be scanning our environment. We're going to be hyper vigilant about all that could be going down. Now, let's say the person who mugged you ran behind you after they took your things. But now another person is coming towards you on the sidewalk. You know, on a head level, it's not the same person because this person's now in front of you, but you're going to be highly avoidant of that person. Chances are you're going to cross the street. You will want to create a fair bit of distance between yourself and that other person. This will not be a conscious decision. You will do this, again, almost like an automatic process. Police officers have found victims of muggings walking down the middle of busy roads, traffic going on either side of them, but those people end up there because of the strength of hyperarousal. That's where they found themselves as being in the safest place to be. Of course, there's incredible muscular tension. There's an explosiveness of nerves. Again, we're in the middle of a soup of neurotransmitters that we normally don't come across. We could certainly call ourselves in a hyperaroused state as being highly anxious. And we know post-traumatic stress is post-traumatic stress disorder is seen as an anxiety disorder. So this is where it's corely held in our bodies under hyperarousal. That's going to be hard to concentrate. Your body's going to feel like you've, just all jangled up. Let's just say you now get home and there your family is at the door. Oh, we were wondering what took you so long. And they hear what happened and they go, oh my God, sit down here. Here, have something to eat. Oh my, what do you need? Oh, here, let's go. Let's go into the living room. Let's watch a show. Get your mind off things. And the question is, well, will you really be able to get your mind off things? And chances are you will not. Because the presence of the experience will be staying with you. It's going to be in your body, certainly as hyperarousal. And then we're going to also see then a shifting of not just physiological holding of the trauma, but the shifting now into psychology. So now we're entering the second core component of post-traumatic stress. And this next component of the notion of there you are on the couch, you got some show on Netflix, you're not watching it because, oh my God, you're playing this again and again in your head, and you're maybe saying to yourself, why in the hell did I walk home? I could have catched an Uber, I could have done this, I could have done that. Your emotional shift is, you've got big emotions going on for you. Your thoughts are going up 100 miles an hour, and we'll see subsequent impact of that re-experiencing in your behavior and how you hold your relationships with your loved ones. All of that is called intrusion. Core characteristic or symptom cluster, if you want to use those words, number 2. So intrusion is patterns of re-experiencing in our thoughts, in our feelings, in our behavior, and towards our loved ones. And we see this is mostly psychological, but of course, all psychology is built on the foundation of our physiology. So we can't necessarily make a clean distinction between those things. If we were just going to focus on intrusion, well, yeah, it's going to be in our thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, just being preoccupied or feeling stuck. Some people say afterwards they felt like they were going crazy because of this intrusion in our thought patterns. They were obsessed. They were so confused. Now, if we shift away from our thought patterns and intrusion and go to our emotional states, this is where we're going to find all the big emotions. The big rage, big anger, fear, terror. These are the core elements, particularly for men, around intrusion. Again, just any big emotion will be marked here. And then we have subsets of those big emotions. You can talk about, hatred of self for for being vulnerable, hatred of one's body for responding that way, feeling guilty about even surviving the whole experience, feeling completely hopeless. These would be subsets of emotional intrusions or intrusive feelings, as we call it. Now, if we keep with intrusion and we see it in behavior, often the behavior is going to be some way of trying to control the immediate environment. Checking the locks on the doors, always scanning around for any signs of danger, acting compulsively, acting impulsively. We can see being aggressive, being mistrustful, being doubtful of others, coming up in intrusive behavior. And again, there's different subsets of that. In the longer term, it may not hold true for the mugging victim. It could hold true. We'll see patterns of re-victimization, or what's referred to as a death instinct, an orientation of that person towards the darkness of life, not the lightness or love, but themes of aggression and death. Lastly, if a person is in deep intrusion, we'll see how this shows up in their interpersonal lives. So we'll see this notion of being needy, being demanding, of being overtly involved, or you could say enmeshed with others. It's like boundaries between people get pretty fuzzy for people who are deeply in intrusion. And here we see risks also take place. Risk of being abusive, risk of being of a proneness for some men of being prone to violence. And certainly in the sexual realm, we would see aspects of sexual risk-taking and sexual compulsivity. Again, maybe not for the mugging example, wanted to use a lighter example for that, but we're here, of course, talking about sexual abuse, sexual assault, and other forms of violence. So these are not overstated words in the slightest. Now, all that and more is the response of intrusion. And intrusion is a very, very painful place to be. So what we'll find then is for the person who is highly intrusive, they can only maintain that position for so long. And then what's going to happen is that they're going to experience something like a numbing out, a dissociating, a switching over to a polar opposite state of mind and soul. And so what we're going to see now is something that is called constriction. Now, constriction, we can go through constriction just like we have gone through intrusion. But before we get into that, just think of constriction. I think constriction is easier to understand. pattern of numbing or avoidance. If I had an elastic band here, I could put the elastic band around my wrist and then notice over the seconds or minutes my hands starting to become numb. And if I banged it on my desk, it won't feel very painful, because that's what happens when we constrict things. The sense of, again, numbness, being cut off, avoidance. So if we paid attention to now the expression of constriction in our thought states, in our cognition, I would be, let's say, like, big deal. Big deal, I got mugged. But they took like $40, the rest are cards. I can get those cards replaced tomorrow if I wanted to. Could we talk about something else? It really isn't a big thing. So a pattern of minimizing, of denying, could be seen here. Avoidance of thoughts, a big deal. If you live in this town long enough, everyone's going to get mugged, kind of thing. Even simple denial could be seen as polarized cognition in terms of moving it to constriction. That's what we know about thought patterns in that state. If we shifted to look more at the emotionality, we had the big emotions at intrusion, but when it comes to constriction, there would be essentially lack of relatable emotions. The term used in the business is called affective numbing. Affect meaning emotions, numbing kind of being cut off from the neck down. Being superficial, feeling dead inside. The number of guys I've worked with who've made reference either to being dead inside or that TV show called The Walking Dead. This is the first place they would go to describe how they feel emotionally. Anger that's inhibited. While in intrusion we would see the big anger, here there would not be the expression of anger, but there may be lots of things going on in that fellow's life that certainly would have anger contained with them, but he's just not allowing himself to express. If we shifted now into looking at constriction in terms of behavior, we would also be finding some certain patterns that would come up. Being passive, avoiding things, avoiding risk, avoiding commitments, avoiding places or people. I remember this one fellow I worked with. He lived in a somewhat of a smallish town. He lived on one side of the town. His work was on the opposite side of town, and where he was abused, it was a recreational complex. It was right in the middle. So, over all the time he was working there, he would take the circuitous route to get to work each day. He wouldn't drive by the center. Part of his work, coached and supported by the other guys, is every week he would shave off a block of his commuting distance, so that he could get used to that proximity of where he was abused. But we could call that, he had a constrictive tendency in that regard. Drinking and drugging. Probably it should have been in capital letters even before I said anything else about constrictive behavior. We see substance use, substance abuse as constriction, because essentially the person is putting substances into their body to numb out. And now the impetus to use could come from the pain of intrusion or the pain of constriction, but the actual using itself would be seen as constrictive behavior. And same for self-injury. Self-injury, the notion of causing physical pain to our bodies, in part as a relief for the psychic or emotional pain one is experiencing. Again, it's similar to using substances biochemically. We can call it constriction as well. Now, lastly, we should talk about how that person who's highly constrictive holds himself in his relationships. And here we would find a pattern of kind of withdrawing, isolating, avoiding, that kind of thing. opportunities could be for him to be with people he cares about. But, he's not doing that. He doesn't want to hold intimacy. He doesn't want to necessarily ask for help or engage in that regard. He doesn't want emotional or sexual intimacy either. Quite a different response than intrusion. So how we come to understand constriction is it's a highly, highly painful place to be. It's as highly painful as intrusion. And yet, and because of that, no one can hold constriction indefinitely. So that person who's deep in constriction, will eventually get triggered by something. And bang-o, they're going to find themselves back in intrusion again. So now we're coming to the dynamic part of trauma. Apart from the hyperarousal we spoke of, that what we've got is now an expression of intrusion on one side, going to constriction on the other side, and back and forth and back and forth. And the pain in people's lives are the deep expressions of those two forces within themselves. So here's what the guys in our program know. They know what trauma looks like. If you ask those guys what they will show a wavy line like this. Because in many ways, we remember symbols much better than words. And you know what? In that same symbol, we can ask them, what does healing look like? And they'll do this. This is what healing looks like. Without the extremes on the sides, without that extreme intrusion or those extremes of constriction. So let's just talk a few things about what will trauma recovery look like using this model. Okay. Hyperarousal is hyperarousal. That's the body stuff that we talked about. If all your trauma was around hyperarousal, then all your interventions need to be on a physiological basis. Talk therapy will not necessarily get you to where you want to go. So it may be ideas like developing a good exercise regime, particularly of aerobic exercise. It's really the best intervention for any pattern of anxiety. So exercise, sleep hygiene, proper nutrition, meditation. Meditation is now seen as to be the best complement to talk therapy when it comes to trauma. Being out in green space, being in the proximity of loved ones, pets. We could go on. There are many, many interventions that would speak well for the physiology of hyperarousal. But now if we're talking about the wobble, what helps? Well, of course, it's a therapeutic relationship that can hold a lot of these elements to allow the person to get back to a more calm and relatively happier place. Here's a couple things to note. Some people wobble very much over on the intrusion side. They're highly intrusive. They still wobble. And some people are highly constrictive. And some people are 50-50. So we know there's different forms of this expression, but we could conclude that everyone wobbles. I have yet to meet a man who's gone through our program who doesn't exhibit this core trait. Here's a couple other things to consider. You probably will make faster progress on intrusion than constriction. So expect that. We consider constriction highly stubborn. Now, this is true, I think, because in intrusion, we have so many feedback loops. And this is how we learn in life. So if I'm a trauma survivor and I'm just getting a sense of what's going on for me and how it's impacting me, and then I hear something like, oh, Rick, your voice just went up now. I can go, oh, I wasn't aware of that. Huh, okay, maybe this is telling me something. If I'm at home and my voice goes up and I see the look of fear on my kids' faces because my voice got raised, well, again, wow, okay, feedback loop. I can curb those behaviors because of that. A lot of the problem with constrictive behavior is it tends to be invisible. It tends not to be evident. For example, if I'm highly constrictive, I'm seeking isolation, I'm not picking up the phone when it rings, and you know what? I've got an appointment with my therapist tomorrow, but I'm going to blow that off because I'm just not feeling right. Well, how am I going to change if I don't pick up that phone or I don't see my therapist? Both are expressions of constriction, but they don't give us a feedback loop for change. So there we go. Here, the sweet line, it's not like a narrow line. That would be unrealistic to expect. But for trauma recovery to occur, we want to take away those deep extremes because the extremes hold the pain. And we can return to this life that doesn't have these big exchanges of mood or energy or thought. And by doing so, we can then start to carve out the life we want to live once again. So that's a sweet spot that we work on. And as the men in my program would say, that's the path that they want to be on. So Becky, I think I'll leave it there. I've just got an eye on the time and happy to get into any angle of this that people want to hear.
Great, thank you, Rick. Really great information as always. We have had a few questions that have come in.
Okay.
The first one, how does a person's natural personality figure into this? Like if I'm naturally someone who is introverted or withdrawn, or if I'm outgoing and energetic, does that influence how I react to trauma? And if the trauma causes a reaction that is vastly different from my natural personality, is that reaction more bothersome or confusing for me and those who know me?
Boy, that's a good thinker of a question. First of all, trauma response will not affect our core personality. Our core personality is our core personality. However, the forces of intrusion or constriction may shift that, maybe those quieter or more regular functions of personality and make them seemingly more extreme. So for someone who tends to be more out, more loud, more extrovert, we may find even a more exaggerated reaction of intrusion. Then again, for the introvert who finds good company in being with themselves and is not highly emotionally expressive, we'll see even a deeper reaction for that. So I think in that sense, the trauma may exaggerate tendencies of personality. Let's use the words introvert, extrovert in that regard. So that I could see, certainly.
Great, thank you. Another question. I've been reading more about the use of psychedelic options for treating trauma symptoms and that it's really helpful for some survivors. What are your thoughts about this?
Okay, well, I have thoughts this is not with the same knowledge set that I have on what I've just shared. So please keep that in mind. When people talk about use of psychedelics in terms of trauma response, you got to keep in mind this is fairly new stuff. There's now just starting, not just starting, but just in the recent history, we've started to see good clinical trials of that. So we don't have decades of experience collectively on that. And I think that also the thing to say, it's not the psychedelic itself. It's a psychedelic and combined in a relationship of safety and trust to process what may come up from the use of the psychedelic. Okay, so that tab or that that plant by itself will not get rid of trauma. However, the power of that plant or that pill within the context of therapeutic alignment or reintegration, and different words he used to describe that. That's where the power lies, the potential lies. Because I have clients who say, oh yeah, I'm really interested in whatever, trying this out for all the pain I'm going through. And it's like, kind of like, buddy, let's slow down here a little bit. When were you planning to do that? In whose company were you planning to do that? There's preparatory work before one takes a substance. There's safety considerations while the person's high. And then there's processing work that occurs after that session or sessions of that substance. And that's what makes it a trauma, a type of trauma therapy. So you do your homework would be my suggestion. Work with a professional who knows what they're doing. Don't not take precautions. These are powerful medicines, and to make them a medicine, they have to be administered the same way, like a medicine. There has to be a proper dosage, it has to be the right context, and all the other safety considerations in place. So that would be my suggestion is be careful, do your homework, and put it in the context of a safe relationship, like a therapeutic relationship.
Great, thank you, Rick. One additional question, does the frequency or duration of the trauma impact the wobble, or is it pretty consistent regardless, like a one-time event versus long-term or repeated abuse?
Yeah, good question. So let's kind of separate them in two. But we know there's about 8 cofactors, if you want to call it that may impact the extent of trauma. Well, we use the term trauma load in our programming. So what would make someone have a higher trauma load? Well, and I'm not going to be able to list off all 8, but the more times they were abused, maybe at a younger age. Trauma might be more so if it was a trust relationship that the abuse came in. If the sexual abuse was penetrative by nature, that could also up the ante for severity of trauma load. Whether there are other factors in the person's life. For example, if the abuse occurred when they were a kid, but there was also family problems like alcoholism, what have you, that could also impact severity. So we need to consider all of that. And yet that's not going to be, it's not like a mathematical equation. We know that some people are more, for lack of better words, disabled from trauma than others. And we don't know if that's a matter of personality or kind of a built-in tolerance or vulnerability or resiliency, but there's a fair degree of unique expression. We can't predict. So now it comes to the wobble. Now we also have to consider, well, how long has a person been working on themselves before they get to this? So some people are highly reactive. They're bouncing back and forth, left and right. And others will have a much slower pace, or maybe as guys work through the program, this is only going to show every now and then in that regard. So we know that there's many different expressions of intensity of the wobble. We could say frequency, severity, and then the time spent in these altered extremes of states. We have to consider that as well. So I think we got 2 moving parts, coming back to your question. The cofactors, the original part, and then the actual wobble expression. Ultimately, the goal is that calm line that exists between the extremes. Both the cofactors and the unique trauma expression, they impact how well they can get to that and at what time.
Great, thank you, Rick. We have one last question, which is great because I know we're coming up towards the end of our time. But the question is, does the the type of trauma in terms of the stigma attached to it, does that have any effect on the person's response? For example, sexual abuse tends to have a lot of stigma attached to it, especially for men,
Yeah.
whereas something else like a car accident or, combat may, be more acceptable to people. Is there a difference there?
Yeah, I think there is. I don't think, though, that we can see how it, excuse me, how it would be represented in the Wobble. So in that sense, the Wobble certainly is useful but not sufficient. We have to put person into context for any type of experience of danger or violence to truly understand the traumatic response. It matters so much. Historically, we can look at 4, if not 5 waves of social acceptance of trauma in this world, and then to see how that social acceptance became disappeared. We saw that in Freud's day when he first started uncovering sexual abuse of young women in his practice, and then he went into denial himself. We saw that in World War II with the first notions of shell shock, wartime experiences. And then shortly after the war, all that knowledge base closed down. We can also see that in that second wave of feminism, where there was talk now of sexual violence and sexual abuse of children. And then we had this wave of false memory syndrome, trying to shut down those memories. So I think the social context means so much, and yet it's not captured in models like the Wobble.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick. Well, I know we've come to the end of our time today. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, and thanks to folks who joined us today for your thoughtful questions. Rick, before we go, do you want to talk briefly about your online support groups?
Well, sure. Thanks for the plug. So, as Becky knows, I'm also affiliated with another nonprofit organization called 1 in 6, which is a stat reference for men experiencing sexual abuse as children. numerical 1, in6.org runs online support groups for guys who've experienced sexual abuse as children or sexual assault as adults. And you can join these. They're 5 times a week. You don't disclose your name. You choose your nickname. And it is group support. It is psychoeducation, kind of like what I just did right here. You can ask questions. And the guys get to know each other. It's really quite amazing. It's all text-based. And so, yeah, if you're at all curious about it, I would say give it a go. It's free of charge. And you can tap into that service wherever you are on the planet. Sessions go for 90 minutes. There's always a professional in the room to help guide the conversation. So we pride ourselves on the safety and the knowledge base and the abilities of the guys to support each other as they shoot toward the goal of recovery and healing. So check it out. And thanks for the plug, Becky.
Of course, you do great work, and I know those are wonderful groups. So thanks so much. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and again for your thoughtful questions, and of course, Rick, for your wonderful presentation and great information. If you all are so inclined, if you were inspired today and want to hear this again, we're going to be offering this presentation again on Thursday. Or if you know someone who could benefit from it, please pass it along. So again, thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.